The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was a place built to impress. It floated at the center of Axis Eternal, a station so large that small moons could fit inside it. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. Thousands of seats rose in rings around a central platform, and in those seats sat the representatives of over 4,000 species. They came in every shape and size. Some breathed oxygen, some breathed methane, some did not breathe at all. Together, they called themselves the Concord, and for 10,000 years they had kept the peace of the galaxy. But peace, as the Velith were learning, was not the same thing as kindness. Liaison Thesic stood at the central platform and looked up at the endless rows of faces. She was tall and thin, with a body made of something between bone and crystal. Her people, the Velith, were beautiful in the way that glass sculptures were beautiful. Light passed through their limbs and scattered into soft colors. Their voices rang like bells. Poets from 100 worlds had written about the Velith and called them living jewels. Now those jewels were cracking. Thesic held up her hands so the assembly could see. Deep fracture lines ran through her fingers. Where there had once been smooth, clear crystal, there were now spiderweb patterns of white and gray. The shattering, her people called it. It had started 8 months ago on Velith Prime, their homeworld. At first, it seemed like a strange illness. A few dozen Velith woke up to find tiny cracks on their arms. Within a week, those cracks spread. Within a month, the first deaths came. The crystal simply broke apart, piece by piece, and the person inside ceased to exist. Now it was everywhere. All 12 Velith colony worlds were infected. Millions were sick. Hundreds of thousands were already dead, and no one knew why. "We are dying," Thesic said. Her voice, which once rang clear and bright, now had a rough edge to it, like a chipped glass dragged across stone. "We come before this assembly not with pride, but with need. We ask for medical researchers. We ask for supplies. We ask for protection while our people are weak. We ask for what this Concord was built to give. We ask for help." The hall was quiet. 4,000 species listened. Then the High Synod, the 5 elder races who truly controlled the Concord, began to speak. The Draethor ambassador went first. The Draethor were massive, armored creatures who valued strength above all else. Their ambassador looked at Thesic the way a person might look at a broken tool. "The Draethor hegemony is sorry for the suffering of the Velith," he said, though his voice carried no sorrow at all. "However, the hegemony must consider the practical realities. The shattering has not spread beyond Velith populations. It poses no threat to the wider Concord. Sending resources to Velith space would pull them from regions of greater strategic importance." The Ool Collective spoke next. The Ool were a hive mind, millions of tiny organisms acting as one. Their voice came from a floating speaker drone. "The Ool have calculated the cost of intervention. The probability of saving the Velith civilization, given current plague progression, is 11%. The resource expenditure required does not justify the expected return." One by one, the elder races spoke. The Manessar Directorate expressed deep regret, but argued that the Concord's charter did not require intervention in natural biological events. The other 2 elder members followed the same line. It was all very calm, very reasonable, very polite, and it was a death sentence. The vote was called. Out of 4,000 represented species, the vast majority followed the lead of the elder races. They always did. That was how the Concord worked. The powerful decided, and the rest agreed. The motion to designate the Velith as a declining civilization passed with an overwhelming majority. It meant that the Velith would lose their alliance protections, their trade rights, and their seat on the council. It meant that in the eyes of the galaxy, they were already dead. Thesic did not scream. She did not shout. She simply stood there on the platform as the vote was read, and her fractured hands trembled at her sides. Then her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees on the cold metal floor. The crack that ran up her left arm split a little wider. A tiny piece of crystal, no bigger than a fingernail, broke off and hit the ground with a sound like a small bell. 4,000 species watched a dying woman kneel on the floor, and nobody moved. Then someone did. Ambassador Elena Vargas of Earth stood up from her seat in the far outer ring, where minor species were placed so they could watch but not matter. She was a short woman with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked like they had not slept in days. Humanity had only been part of the Concord for 300 years. They were considered young, emotional, and unimportant. Their seat was so far from the center that Vargas had to take a transport pod just to reach the platform. But she reached it. She knelt beside Fesic on the cold floor. She did not care that every eye in the hall was on her. She did not care that the Dryther ambassador was staring at her with open contempt. She put her hand, warm and soft and made of flesh, on Fesic's shoulder, which was cold and hard and slowly breaking apart. "I voted against this," Vargas said quietly. "Humanity voted against this." Fesic looked at her. Up close, Vargas could see that the cracks had reached her face. Tiny lines ran across her cheeks like frozen tears. "It does not matter," Fesic whispered. "The vote is done. We are alone." "No," Vargas said. "You are not." The hall had gone completely silent. Even the drafteur had stopped talking. Every translator in the building carried Vargas's words to 4,000 species, and not one of them knew what to do with them. Vargas helped Fesic to her feet. She walked her off the platform, slowly, carefully, holding her arm as if she were made of something precious. Because she was. Later that night, alone in her quarters on Axis Eternal, Ambassador Elena Vargas sat at her communication terminal and typed a message to Earth. It was short. It was not diplomatic. It was not careful. It read, "They left them to die. I told them we wouldn't. Don't make me a liar." She sent it and sat back in her chair. Outside her window, the stars of the galaxy burned in every direction, cold and beautiful and very, very far apart. Somewhere out there, a species of living crystal was shattering, and a galaxy of 4,000 civilizations had decided it was not their problem. Elena Vargas closed her eyes and thought about the sound a tiny piece of crystal makes when it hits the floor. Like a bell. Like a small, clear bell ringing in an empty room where no one is listening. She decided she was going to make them listen. The message from Ambassador Vargas arrived on Earth at 3 a.m, Sol Standard Time. By sunrise, it had reached every member of the United Council. By noon, it had leaked to the public. By evening, 4 billion people on Earth, Mars, Luna, and the outer colonies had read it, and the arguments had already begun. Premier Adesio Conquo sat in her office in Nairobi and read the message 7 times. She was a tall woman with a calm face that hid a mind always working 3 steps ahead. She had led the Sol Coalition for 6 years, and in that time, she had learned one important truth about galactic politics. The Concord did not respect humanity. They tolerated it. There was a difference. Helping the Velith meant going against the Concord's decision. It meant telling 4,000 species and 5 elder races that humanity disagreed with them and was willing to act on that disagreement. The consequences could be severe. Trade restrictions, political isolation. In the worst case, the same declining civilization label that had just been given to the Velith. Her advisors told her it was too dangerous. Her military commanders told her they were not strong enough. Her economists told her they could not afford it. Then she read the message one more time, and she called an emergency session of the full United Council. The council chamber in Nairobi was not as grand as the Concord's hall. It was a simple room, with simple chairs and a window that looked out over the city. But the people in it carried the voice of every human alive. And when Premier Okonkwo stood before them, they listened. She did not read Vargas's message. Instead, she read something else. Before the Concord vote, Fesick had sent a private, untranslated plea to every member species. The diplomatic version had been cleaned up and made formal. But the raw version, the one Fesick had recorded in her own language before the translators smoothed it out, was different. Okonkwo played it for the council. Fesick's voice filled the room, cracked and rough and desperate. The translation appeared on every screen. It was not a political speech. It was a mother talking about her children. She described watching her youngest daughter hold up her hands and ask why they were breaking. She described the sound of Velith crying, which was like wind passing through a broken window. She described carrying the dead, whose bodies came apart in your arms, like dry sand. She ended with a single sentence. If anyone is listening, please come. We do not want to die alone. The council chamber was completely silent when the recording finished. Okonkwo looked at every face in the room, one by one, and then she said, "We are listening. The question is what we do about it." The vote took less than an hour. It was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. Operation Open Hand was approved. Humanity would help the Velith, with or without the galaxy's permission. What happened next surprised the galaxy, though it should not have. The elder races thought of humanity as a minor species, small and unimportant. They forgot something basic about humans. Humans were not powerful because of their technology or their military. Humans were powerful because when they decided to do something, they did it with every part of themselves. The mobilization was massive. On Earth, the greatest medical universities opened emergency research programs focused on Velith biology. Xenobiologists who had spent their careers studying alien life were pulled from their normal work and reassigned. Idris Keita, a quiet man from Dakar who had spent 20 years studying crystalline biology, was put in charge of a research team of 300 specialists and given a single order: find out what is killing the Velith and stop it. The Sol Coalition Navy moved next. Admiral Ryo Tanaka, a careful and clever officer who preferred thinking to fighting, repositioned 3 full fleets to the Velith corridor, the stretch of space between human territory and Velith worlds. The ships did not attack anyone. They did not threaten anyone. They simply appeared and stayed, a wall of metal and silence that said very clearly that anyone who wanted to reach the Velith would have to go through Earth first. But the military was only one part of it. The civilian response was something the galaxy had never seen before. Cargo ships, some of them private vessels owned by ordinary people, began flying supplies to Velith space. Food, medicine, construction materials, atmospheric regulators, water purifiers. Colony ships that had been built to carry humans to new worlds were converted into floating hospitals. Volunteers signed up by the millions. Doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, cooks, counselors. They came from every country on Earth, every colony on Mars, every station orbiting Jupiter. They came because they had heard a mother crying about her daughter's hands, and they could not sit still after that. The supplies reached Velith Prime within weeks. The Velith, who had expected to die alone, watched human ships fill their skies. They watched strange, soft-bodied creatures with warm hands walk into their hospitals and begin working. The humans did not speak Velith. The Velith did not speak human languages. But hands that heal do not need translators. The Galactic Concord responded exactly as expected. Humanity was overstepping its station. The action was unauthorized. The Draethor ambassador gave a speech in which he called humans emotional children playing savior to a corpse that does not know it is dead yet. The speech was broadcast across the galaxy. It was meant to embarrass humanity into backing down. Ambassador Elena Vargas, still stationed on Axis Eternal and still refusing to leave, requested the right to respond. The Concord granted it, expecting an apology. Vargas stood on the same platform where Thesic had fallen. She looked up at the same rows of faces, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "The Draethor ambassador calls the Velith a corpse. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps they will die, despite everything we do. But if they are a corpse, then we will be pallbearers. We will carry them with dignity and with love, because that is what you do for the dead. What you do not do, what we will never do, is step over the body and pretend it is not there." She paused. The hall was silent. "We will not be bystanders," she said. "Not today, not ever." The elder races said nothing. What could they say? The humans were not threatening war. They were not making demands. They were simply helping someone. And somehow, that was the most dangerous thing anyone had done in the Concord in 1,000 years. Meanwhile, on Velis Prime, deep inside a research lab that humans had built in 3 days, using prefabricated materials they had brought from Earth, Dr. Idris Keita was staring into a microscope. He had been working for 40 hours without sleep. His eyes burned, his back ached, but he could not stop, because what he was seeing did not make sense. The shattering was not a disease. Diseases evolved naturally. They had patterns, histories, genetic trails that showed where they came from and how they changed over time. The shattering had none of that. Its molecular structure was too clean, too precise, too perfect. It attacked Velith crystal biology with a specificity that no natural virus could achieve. It was like finding a key that fit only one lock in the universe. Nature did not make keys like that. People did. Keita pulled back from the microscope and looked at his colleague, Dr. Amara Olse, who was running chemical analyses at the next table. His face was pale, his hands were steady, but his voice was not. "Amara," he said quietly, "this is not a plague." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone built this. The shattering is a weapon. Someone made it, and someone used it on the Velith on purpose." The lab went quiet. Outside the window, the sky of Velis Prime was full of human ships, and below them, a civilization was crumbling. Not because of nature. Not because of bad luck. Because someone wanted them dead. And now the only question was who and why. Dr. Idris Keita did not sleep for 3 more days after his discovery. Neither did anyone on his team. They pulled the shattering apart molecule by molecule, mapped every piece of its structure, and confirmed what Keita had seen in the microscope. The plague was artificial. Every part of it had been designed with a level of precision that only a handful of civilizations in the galaxy could achieve. It targeted Velith biology with surgical accuracy, and it left every other species completely untouched. This was not a disease. This was murder on a planetary scale. Keita sent his findings to Ambassador Vargas in a sealed message. She read it sitting alone in her quarters on Axis Eternal, and for a long time she did not move. Then she got to work. Vargas was a diplomat, not a spy. But she had spent 300 years worth of human experience in galactic politics to draw from. And she knew one thing very well. The Concord was full of secrets, and secrets made people careless. She needed to find out who had built the shattering, and the answer was somewhere in the tangled web of galactic politics. She started with what she knew. The bioweapon required technology that only Concord-tier civilizations possessed. That narrowed the list to a few dozen species. The weapon specifically targeted the Velith. That meant the attacker had detailed knowledge of Velith biology, access to Velith genetic data, and a reason to want them gone. Vargas reached out to the only allies she had. The Tesserae were a small, quiet species of traders who looked like tall birds covered in soft gray feathers. They were not powerful. They controlled no fleets, but they traded with everyone, which meant they heard everything. Humanity had helped the Tesserae decades ago during a trade dispute, giving them legal support when the elder races tried to crush their shipping routes. The Tesserae had long memories, and they still felt that debt. A Tesserae contact named Velis met Vargas in a small, dark room on the lower levels of Axis Eternal, where the station's maintenance workers lived and the security cameras did not reach. Velis was nervous. Her feathers were pressed flat against her body, which was the Tesserae version of fear. "I should not be here," Velis said. "I know," Vargas replied, "but I need your help. Someone made the shattering, someone in the Concord." Velis was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The Tesserae trade in many things. Information is one of them. For 6 months before the shattering appeared, we noticed unusual activity in Menessar space. Large shipments of biological research equipment, sealed labs on remote stations. Purchases of Velith genetic material from black market sources." "The Messar," Vargas said. "There is more." Velis leaned forward. "Do you know what sits beneath the surface of Velith Prime? A fold nexus. A point where subspace bends in a way that allows faster-than-light travel without the usual energy cost. There are only a few dozen in the galaxy. The Messar Directorate has been quietly building a transit network using fold nexuses for the past century. Velith Prime is the final piece. With it, they would control trade routes across half the galaxy." Vargas felt something cold settle in her stomach. And the Velith were in the way. Yes, but simply attacking the Velith would have caused a war. The Concord would have intervened. So the Messar needed the Velith to disappear quietly. A natural plague, a sad story. And then, once the Velith were gone, the Messar would move in and claim the Nexus. And the other elder races? The Drathawar? The Ool? Velis looked at the floor. They were offered shares in the transit network, access to the fastest trade routes in the galaxy. In exchange, they voted to let the Velith die. Vargas sat in the dark room for a long time after Velis left. She thought about Thesic kneeling on the floor of the Concord chamber. She thought about the sound of crystal cracking. She thought about a galaxy where the powerful could decide to erase a whole species for a trade route, and nobody would ever know. Then she gathered every piece of evidence she had: Kata's research, Tessari intelligence, shipping records, financial data, and she requested an emergency session of the High Synod. The Concord's Great Hall was full when Vargas took the platform. She could feel the hostility in the room. Humanity had already been warned. They had already been criticized. The elder races expected her to apologize, or beg, or at least be quiet. She was none of those things. Vargas presented the evidence piece by piece. She showed the molecular analysis of the shattering and its artificial structure. She showed the shipping records of biological equipment moving through Menessar space. She showed the financial connections between the Menessar, the Drathur, and the Ool. She showed the plans for the transit network and the location of the fold nexus beneath Velith Prime. And then she said, the Velith were not struck by a plague. They were attacked. They were attacked by a member of this Concord, and other members of this Concord helped cover it up. The shattering is not a tragedy, it is a crime. And every species in this hall that voted to abandon the Velith was made a part of that crime without their knowledge. The hall erupted. The Menessar ambassador rose and called the evidence a fabrication. The Drathur ambassador demanded that Vargas be removed from the platform. The Ool collective declared that the accusations were statistically unsupported. Voices shouted over each other in 100 languages, and the translators could barely keep up. But beneath the noise, something else was happening. The minor species, the ones who sat in the outer rings and never spoke, were looking at each other. They were looking at the evidence on their screens, and they were beginning to understand something that the elder races did not want them to understand. If it could happen to the Velith, it could happen to any of them. The Manessar ambassador called for an immediate vote to expel humanity from the Concord. The charge was deliberate disruption of galactic order and the spreading of false information intended to undermine Concord unity. The vote was held, and because the elder races controlled enough influence to push it through, the motion passed. Humanity was expelled from the Galactic Concord. The announcement was broadcast across every system in the galaxy. Humanity was no longer a member of the Alliance. Trade embargoes were put in place. Supply lines were cut. Human colonies that depended on galactic trade networks were suddenly isolated. Ambassador Vargas stood on the platform after the vote and did not flinch. She looked up at the elder races, who stared back at her with the satisfied expressions of those who believed they had won. "You have removed us from your alliance," Vargas said, "but you have not removed us from this galaxy, and you have not changed what we know. The evidence is public now. Every species in this hall has it. You can expel us, but you cannot unexpel the truth." She walked out of the hall with her head held high, and she did not look back. What happened next was something the elder races had not planned for. Within days of humanity's expulsion, the Tessari Trade Confederation announced that it was leaving the Concord voluntarily and would be joining humanity in supporting the Velith. The Korvaxi, a species of small and stubborn engineers who had been ignored by the Concord for centuries, did the same. Then the Galoon, a race of sensor specialists, whose homeworld had once been threatened by Draether expansion. Then a dozen more, then 24. They were all minor species. None of them were powerful alone. But together, standing beside humanity, they formed something the galaxy had not seen before. An alliance built not on power or profit, but on the simple idea that people should help each other. Premier Okonkwo addressed the galaxy in an open broadcast. Her face was tired but steady. "You taught us what the Concord truly is," she said. "Not an alliance, a hierarchy, a place where the strong decide who lives and who dies, and the rest are expected to be quiet. We reject it, and as you can see, we are not alone." Behind her, on the screens that every species in the galaxy could see, the flags and symbols of 40 allied species appeared, one by one. The Messar Directorate watched this from their homeworld, and felt, for the first time in centuries, something they were not used to feeling: uncertainty. Their plan had been perfect. The plague, the vote, the slow erasure of the Velith. It should have worked. They decided that half measures were over. If the Velith would not die quietly, they would die loudly. The Messar began mobilizing their war fleets toward Velith space. And across the galaxy, on 100 worlds, humans and their allies looked up at the stars and prepared to stand in the way. Admiral Ryo Tanaka stood on the bridge of the ESS Defiance and stared at the tactical display. The screen showed the Velith corridor, a wide stretch of empty space between the Velith home systems and the Menasar territory. On one side, his fleet. On the other side, what was coming for them. The Menasar armada was enormous. 2,800 warships, built over a century of quiet preparation. Dreadnoughts the size of small cities. Carrier ships filled with automated fighters. Siege vessels designed to break planets. The Menasar had not fought a war in 400 years, but they had never stopped building for one. Their fleet was a machine designed for one purpose: to crush anything in its path. Tanaka's coalition fleet had 912 ships. Human destroyers and cruisers made up the core. Tessari frigates, fast and light, held the flanks. Korvaxi drone carriers sat in the rear, their hangars full of small, cheap combat drones that the Korvaxi engineers had been modifying and improving every day since they arrived. Gellen's sensor platforms drifted in wide arcs around the fleet, their instruments watching everything within 10 light minutes. 912 against 2,800. The numbers were clear. The math was simple. They would lose. Tanaka was not a man who believed in miracles. He was a man who believed in preparation, creativity, and the willingness to do what the enemy did not expect. He had spent his entire career studying how smaller forces defeated larger ones, and every lesson came down to the same thing. Never fight the battle your enemy wants you to fight. He called his commanders together for a final briefing. Their faces appeared on screens around his bridge, human and alien alike. Captain Marin Solberg of the cruiser group, Wing Commander Tessig Vaughn of the Tessari frigates, Korvaxi Fleetmaster Gent, whose voice always sounded like gravel being crushed, Jellan Sensor Lead Oma, who spoke so quietly that everyone had to lean forward to hear. "They outnumber us 3-1, Tanaka said. "Their ships are bigger, better armed, and better armored. In a straight fight, they destroy us in 4 hours, so we are not going to give them a straight fight." He pulled up a map of the corridor. Near the center, a vast nebula of charged gas and heavy particles spread across the route like a wall of fog. The Messar would have to either go through it or go around it. Going around would add 2 days to their approach. The Messar were confident. The Messar were in a hurry. They would go through. "This nebula is our weapon," Tanaka said. "Inside it, long-range sensors fail. Targeting systems lose accuracy. Communication becomes unreliable. Their numbers stop mattering because they cannot coordinate. It becomes close, tight, and ugly. And that is where we win." The Korvaxi Fleetmaster made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You want to fight in the dark." "I want to fight in our dark," Tanaka said, "not theirs." The Messar arrived 2 days later. Their fleet moved in perfect formation, a wall of metal and light that stretched across the stars. The Messar fought the way they did everything, with mathematical precision, hierarchical command, and absolute confidence in their superiority. Every ship knew its position. Every captain followed orders from above. It was efficient. It was disciplined. It was predictable. Tanaka positioned his fleet at the edge of the nebula and waited. When the Messar approached, he gave the order that no galactic military textbook would have recommended. He retreated. The coalition fleet turned and moved into the nebula, slowly, deliberately, like something wounded, running for cover. The Messar commander, a senior officer named Director Kalas, watched from his flagship, the Absolute Certainty, and saw exactly what he expected to see. A small, weak fleet running away. He ordered his armada to pursue. They entered the nebula. Inside, everything changed. The charged particles filled sensor screens with noise. Targeting computers, designed for the clean emptiness of open space, struggled to lock on to anything. Communication signals broke apart and scattered. The Messar formation, which depended on precise coordination, began to stretch and bend as ships lost contact with each other. And in the fog, the coalition was waiting. Human destroyers, running silent with their emissions dampened, appeared out of the murk at close range and hit Messar ships before they could react. Tessari frigates, the fastest ships in the fleet, darted through gaps in the Messar formation, striking from the sides and vanishing before the heavy guns could turn. The Messar found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not pin down. The first engagement lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Messar had lost 140 ships. The coalition had lost 63. The numbers still favored the Messar, but the damage to their confidence was far greater than the damage to their fleet. Director Kalas pulled his forces back to the edge of the nebula and called for reinforcements. 300 more Messar warships arrived within a day. He would not be humiliated again. This time, he sent his ships in smaller, tighter groups, each one covering the others. It was a good adjustment, a smart one. But Tanaka had already planned for it. The Korvaxi drone carriers launched everything they had. Thousands of small, cheap combat drones flooded into the nebula. The drones were not powerful. Individually, They could barely scratch a Messar warship. But the core Vaxi had reprogrammed them using principles borrowed from human artificial intelligence research. And now they did not fight like machines. They fought like swarms. They found the gaps between ships. They targeted sensors and communication arrays. They blinded the Messar and then darted away before the guns could find them. At the same time, the Gelun sensor platforms, positioned outside the nebula where their instruments still worked, fed targeting data to the Coalition fleet through a communication system that the Tasari had built using human electronic warfare technology. The Coalition could see in the fog. The Messar could not. The second engagement was worse for the Messar than the first. They lost 260 ships. The Coalition lost 89. The nebula was becoming a graveyard, and the Messar were burying more of their own than they were killing. But Director Kalas was not finished. He pulled his remaining fleet together and made a decision that changed everything. He would not fight in the nebula anymore. He would go around it, accept the delay, and take his main force directly to Velis Prime. He detached his flagship, the Absolute Certainty, along with his 500 best warships, and set course for the Velith homeworld at maximum speed. Tanaka saw it on his screens and made his own decision. He could not stop the main Messar fleet and protect Velis Prime at the same time. He had to choose. He chose both. He split his fleet. The bulk of the Coalition stayed in the nebula to hold the remaining Messar ships. Tanaka himself, with the Defiance and 40 of his fastest ships, burned at full speed to intercept the Absolute Certainty. They caught up at the edge of the Velis system. Tanaka's 40 ships against Kalos's 500. The math was beyond hopeless. It was absurd. Tanaka opened a communication channel, not to his own fleet, to the Messar, to Director Kalos personally. And because it was an open channel, every species in the galaxy that was watching, and by now all of them were, heard what he said. Director Kalos, you calculated that no one would fight for the Velith. You built a plague to kill them quietly, and when that failed, you brought a fleet to kill them loudly. Every step of your plan was based on one assumption, that the Velith did not matter enough for anyone to stand in your way. He paused. On the bridge of the Defiance, every officer was silent. Every screen showed the Messar fleet, vast and terrible, filling the stars ahead. You were wrong, Tanaka said. Recalculate. The Messar fleet stopped, not because of 40 human ships, not because of Tanaka's words, but because at that moment, a message arrived from the Concord's Axis Eternal, the Dreythur hegemony, watching the battle unfold and watching galactic opinion turn against them, had withdrawn their support for the Messar. The Ul Collective followed minutes later, without political cover, without allies, and with the eyes of the galaxy upon them. The Messar had no path forward that did not end in ruin. Director Kalos stared at the small human ship on his screen. He had 500 warships. He could destroy it in minutes. But the galaxy was watching, and the galaxy had changed. The Messar fleet turned and withdrew. On Velis Prime, in the hospital ship Mercy Unbroken, Dr. Idris Kita's team announced what they had been working toward for months. A nanite-based treatment that could halt the shattering and repair the damaged crystal. The first patients were treated that day. Within hours, the cracks stopped spreading. Within days, new crystal began to grow, clear and strong, filling in the fractures like scars healing over. Velith children held up their hands and found them whole. Liaison Fesic, her body held together by human medical technology, walked slowly to the viewport of the Mercy Unbroken. Outside, the Messar fleet was disappearing into the dark between stars. Below, Velis Prime turned slowly, battered but alive. Fesic placed her fractured hand against the cold glass and watched the lights of human ships moving through her sky. She whispered one word, the first Velith word she had ever taught Ambassador Vargas. back when Vargas had knelt beside her on the floor of the Concord chamber. Kethel. It meant those who stayed. 1 year passed, and the galaxy was not the same place it had been before. The old Galactic Concord still existed on paper, but it was a hollow thing now, like a building with the walls still standing, but nothing inside. The Emissar Directorate had not collapsed, but it had cracked. When the truth about the shattering became public knowledge, confirmed by independent researchers from dozens of species, the Emissar's own people began asking questions that their leaders could not answer. The lower castes, the workers and builders and ordinary citizens who had never been allowed to speak, started speaking. They held gatherings. They asked why their government had tried to erase a whole species for a trade route, and the silence from above told them everything they needed to know. The Drythor hegemony, who had always presented themselves as the strongest and most honorable civilization in the galaxy, found that honor was harder to claim when everyone knew you had helped cover up a genocide for money. Their ambassador resigned. Then their military council resigned. Then their trade minister. The hegemony did not fall, but it bent, and for a species that prided itself on never bending, that was enough. The Ul Collective, the great hive mind that had calculated the Velith were not worth saving, discovered that math without morality was just numbers. Other species stopped trusting their calculations. Trade partners pulled away. The collective fragmented as individual hive clusters began making their own decisions, something that had not happened in the Ul's recorded history. And while the old powers struggled, something new was being built. The Concord of Equals was formally ratified on a warm afternoon on Velis Prime, in a great open field where Velith crystal flowers had just begun to bloom again after months of death. Representatives from 42 species stood together under a sky that was clear for the first time in a year. The smoke from the emergency factories and medical stations finally gone. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no towering halls or floating platforms. Just a field, a table, and a document. Ambassador Elena Vargas had written the founding charter herself, though she had asked for input from every member species. Most of the document was practical, dealing with trade agreements, mutual defense, scientific cooperation, and resource sharing. But the first clause, the one that came before everything else, was different. It was not practical at all. It was a promise. It read, "No member shall be abandoned. No people shall be deemed expendable. The measure of this alliance is not how it treats the powerful, but how it answers the forgotten." Every representative signed it. Some used pens, some used claws, some used tendrils or beams of focused light. The Korvoxy Fleetmaster, Gent, pressed his thumb into the document so hard that he nearly tore the paper. And when someone pointed this out, he said, "Good, it should be hard to remove." The Velith were the last to sign. Liaison Thesic, who had been elected Speaker of the Velith people in the months after the crisis, walked to the table with slow, careful steps. Her body had healed, mostly. The human nanite treatment had stopped the shattering and repaired the worst of the damage. Thin lines of white ran through her crystal skin like rivers on a map, marking where the cracks had been. She did not hide them. She said they were reminders. Thesic signed the charter, and the Velith crystal flowers in the field rang softly in the wind, a sound like 1,000 tiny bells. The Velith in the crowd began to sing, a low, resonant hum that made the air vibrate and the ground tremble. It was a song of gratitude, the oldest one they had, written in a time before they had reached the stars, back when they were still young and the universe was still full of wonder. The humans did not understand the words, but they understood the feeling. Several of them cried. They tried not to, because humans often feel embarrassed about crying in public, but they could not help it. "Doctor," Idris Keita, who had saved millions of lives with his research, and still insisted he was just doing his job, stood in the back of the crowd and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and pretended he was not doing it. After the signing, the Velith unveiled their gift to humanity. On the highest hill near the field, a structure had been growing for months. It was a spire, tall and slender, made entirely of living Velith crystal. The crystal was clear at the base, and shifted through every color as it rose, ending in a point that caught the sunlight and scattered it in all directions. It was the most beautiful thing any human present had ever seen. The Velith called it the Kethal Pillar. When the wind passed through it, it vibrated at specific frequencies that the Velith could hear and feel in their bones. Translated roughly into human language, the frequency said, "They came when no one else would." Premier Adizea Okonkwo stood beside Thesic at the base of the pillar, and looked up at it for a long time without speaking. The sunlight played across her face, colored by the crystal. "You did not have to do this," Okonkwo said. "We did," Thesic replied. "My people have a belief. When someone saves your life, you must make something beautiful for them, something that will last longer than either of you, so that when both of you are gone, the universe will still remember what happened between you." Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We did not do anything extraordinary, Thesic. We just did what we could not live with ourselves for not doing." Thesic turned to look at her. The white scar lines on her face caught the light. "Before your people came," she said, "we thought kindness between species was a myth. A story we told our children to help them sleep. The galaxy had taught us that survival was all that mattered, and that no one would help you survive but yourself. You made that story real. You turned a myth into something we could touch." She placed her hand, still marked with faint fracture lines, on the pillar. "This is what it feels like," she said. "Solid, warm, real." In the months that followed, the Concord of Equals grew. Species that had spent centuries being ignored or exploited by the old Concord found a place where their voices were heard. The Tessari, whose trade network stretched across the galaxy, became the economic backbone of the new alliance. The Korvaxi, whose engineering skills had always been undervalued, built stations and ships and infrastructure that rivaled anything the elder races had produced. The Gelun mapped regions of space that had never been properly charted, opening new routes and new possibilities. And humanity, the species that the elder races had called young and emotional and unimportant, found itself at the center of something it had never expected. Not an empire, not a dominion, a community. The Draethor hegemony, humbled and reformed under new leadership, quietly applied for observer status in the Concord of Equals. It was granted. Other former Concord members followed. The galaxy was not healed. There were still wounds, still anger, still scars that would take generations to fade. But the direction had changed. The current was flowing towards something better. And it had started because one human woman knelt beside a dying alien on a cold floor and refused to walk away. Elena Vargas, who had never wanted to be a leader and still was not sure she was qualified for the job, was elected the first Secretary General of the Concord of Equals. Her office was on a new station called Haven Axis, built by Korvaxi engineers in orbit around a neutral star. It was smaller than Axis Eternal. The ceilings were lower. The chairs were more comfortable. There were plants, real ones, growing in pots on the windowsills, because Vargas said she could not think without something green to look at. On her first day in the office, she sat at her desk and opened the file of species requesting membership in the new alliance. There were hundreds. Some were powerful. Some were small. Some she had never heard of. Each one had its own story, its own needs, its own reasons for wanting to be part of something that treated them as more than a number on a ledger. She started reading. Her aide, a young Tessari named Pell, brought her coffee, which the Tasari had learned to make, because humans seemed unable to function without it. Pell set the cup down and looked at the stack of applications and the tired woman behind them. "Secretary General," Pell said, "did you ever think it would come to this? When you knelt beside Thesic on the floor of the old synod, did you imagine all of this?" Vargas picked up her coffee and took a sip. It was too hot, and she made a face. And then she looked out the window at the stars. There were so many of them, each one a sun, each sun with worlds, each world with people. So many people, spread across so much darkness, all looking for the same thing. "No," she said, "I did not think about what would come. I just thought someone should help." She set the coffee down, pulled the first application toward her, and began to read. Outside the window, the galaxy turned. It was vast and old, and full of light and darkness in equal measure. It had seen empires rise and fall. It had watched species bloom and vanish. It had been cruel, and it had been cold, and for a very long time, it had operated on a single, simple rule. The strong survive, and the weak are forgotten. But now, in one small corner of that galaxy, a different rule was being written. Not by the strongest species, or the most advanced, or the most ancient. By the ones who showed up. By the ones who looked at a dying stranger and saw someone worth saving. By the ones who said, "We will not be bystanders," and meant it, even when it cost them everything. The galaxy had always believed that power was the currency of survival, that the strong endured and the weak were forgotten. Humanity taught it a different lesson. The species willing to kneel beside the dying, to fight for the abandoned, to bleed for strangers, those were the ones the galaxy would follow. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the smartest, not because they had the best ships or the biggest guns, but because they were the ones who showed up. And that, in the end, was enough.